All right, well, welcome everyone, and we apologize for being late. I know that some folks are getting online and coming to see this today because it is very exciting to be able to connect what we're talking about at the national level as well as what needs to happen in the classroom. And it seems like education is always going to be very tight and clear and only talking about one level. But in fact, there are multiple layers to this, and we're going to break this problem down today. So I'm going to pass it to my friend and colleague and PhD student, Shelby, who is going to introduce what we're going to do today.
Yeah, so I'll first just start with a super brief introduction. A lot of people in the room know me, but for everybody else, my name is Shelbi Kuhlmann, and I am a doctoral student here at the University of Georgia. I just finished my third year. I was about to say I'm a third year student, but I guess that's actually over now. So I'll be graduating in 1 year with my PhD in educational psychology. So super excited about having this talk, and I want to thank and welcome Dr. JJ Walcott for being here with us today. I'm going to introduce her a little bit. You guys might know her, but everyone in the room might not know her as much. So JJ has quite a bit of different aspects of knowledge that she's coming from lots of different directions with this topic. So she is a trained psychologist. She got her PhD from Florida State University, which we'll forgive her for doing that. But she got her PhD there in developmental psychology. She's worked as a psychologist. She's been working in military and education training, looking at military readiness. And then in the last few years, she's been working as a government scientist in the executive branch, which makes her just so fit to have this conversation with us today. So I'm really excited about having her. So I want to welcome her. I'll let you maybe just explain a little bit more, at least for the people in this room, maybe about what you've been doing.
Sure. So I will add one important fact, because we always ask this when we talk about education. Have you spent any time in the classroom? And so my dissertation, actually I was working with special needs kids. So I spent a fair amount of time in the classroom, K-12 classrooms, both regular ed as well as special ed. And my PhD is actually, I did social and emotional development of deaf children. So I spent a fair amount of time since I was probably, 13, I think, when I started working with deaf kids, all the way through. When I say I'm passionate about finishing a project, I'm not kidding. It is difficult to find researchers that will do that kind of work. But what's exciting is by having multiple different experiences, both in K-12 as well as with the military, and then subsequently internationally, meaning I got to spend a lot of time with our friends in the Nordic countries, which a lot of you may know, they do some really fantastic things in education, and looking not just at national education policy, but international education policy. So what are they doing with Africa, and how are they building that up, and how are we making sure that we're going worldwide and how we're sharing information? It just has so many implications, or as I like to say, education is the foundation for everything. So it's super important, but in our country, we are really having a disconnect. We have these like tactical level problems in the classrooms where teachers are not making enough money, and where we have behavioral issues that are very serious, and we have kids who aren't even ready to learn because they don't have the right food and they don't have all the supports they need at home or in the classroom. But that doesn't mean we don't also need to be thinking about that national level space as well. Having that strategy of making sure what's happening to kids as they come out of high school, what's happening to young people coming out of college or trade schools or anything else, but also what's going to happen when we start having automation come. And all of you get to have 3 to 6 careers in your life. Lucky you. So Harvard's telling us it's not just going to be you move up in your job, you're actually going to change careers. So today you may be a psychologist or a scientist or a teacher, and tomorrow you may go become an engineer. Or more likely, something we haven't seen today. How do you make that transition? So education is going to span a lifetime, and I think that's going to be a major change for sure.
I think that will transition us a little bit into our next slides, just talking about how education will be changing, or really is changing, and how we can make efforts to be prepared for that change and to move that change forward. So we kind of have a little breakdown here of the industrial age, and now we've moved into the information age. And really, even if you just look in this classroom, right, the classroom is a little bit different than this, but I mean, really genuinely, in a lot of classrooms, we still kind of see these seeing things where we're looking at learning. I know the board is a little bit cutting that off, but that says time-based and episodic. It's assembly line like. It's one size fits all, it's input focused, it's passive, it's focused on transferring facts and skills from experts to students, right? It's kind of, I stand up here as the expert, you guys sit there as learners, I'm going to pour all of my knowledge into your bucket, you will then carry your bucket onward, and it's just this really great process. I kind of wish it worked like that, right? It would be so much easier if it worked like that, but we know that that's not really what's effective. So the hope is that we can move forward from this, right? We can start looking into what JG was talking about, looking at learning as a lifelong continuum, interconnecting learning, making learning personalized and outcome focused, making it active, such an important thing to talk about, and making it more focused on fostering these 21st century competencies. So this is how we can imagine the future learning ecosystem. It seems like this great, amazing, exciting, and fantastic thing, but the reality is, how do we do that? And that's really what matters a lot, right? How do we really make this happen? So what we're going to talk about today are 3 topic areas, being lifelong learning, technology, and learner-driven strategies. So I will let JJ take it away. Well, first we'll talk a little bit about just kind of each of these things and maybe the challenges related to them. So the question is, how do we innovate education? And more importantly, like JJ was talking about, we have, and she's such an expert and knows so much about how we can make this, how we make this look on a national scale, on a federal scale. What can we make it look like from the top? But then what does that really look like from the bottom? So I know in this room there's lots of educators, education researchers, students. If you spend a lot of time in the classroom yourself, you know that a lot of the decisions being made at the top are not necessarily transferring into the classroom, into actual practice. So what does that look like? How do we do that? That seems like a bridge that's somewhat difficult to cross over and to build. So we propose kind of by doing these 3 things, like fostering lifelong learning, which sounds like such an amazing, great, fantastic thing to do. Like, we totally need to do this. But how do we really foster lifelong learning when we're looking at kids who are not motivated to even go to school, who are not engaged when they're in the classroom? I don't know how many of you have had a student who have said that their favorite period during the day is lunchtime, right? Yeah. So that is, I regularly hear that. Their favorite period is PE. Or you might even get lucky enough to hear a student say, you know, I love English or I love science, but then everything else can just kind of, you know, go in the trash. So we don't care about those things as much. So
but can I be devil's advocate? What's
yeah.
wrong with loving lunch and PE?
Yes, very true.
Right? I mean, one of my closest girlfriends is this really high up executive in actually an education company, which I won't name. But I asked her one day, what is the secret to your success? She says, you know, it's very interesting. It isn't the fact that I know more than anyone else. It's the fact that I can modulate my emotions in very stressful social situations better than anyone else. And because she can handle all that stress, she just kept moving up the ladder. So I would argue that in fact, time spent at lunch and time spent out in PE does actually matter significantly, and we are abandoning some of those things in order to focus on that time-based elements of being in class. If you didn't clock the time, then it didn't count. On the other hand, what if I'm energized enough to learn what I needed to in 30 minutes and 15 because I enjoyed and I had a good time and I was ready to learn when I came into the classroom after PE. It's a different way of looking at it, but there are actually a lot of studies that support that. I think they gave some kids, it was one of them where they did, I'm going to date myself, it was Guitar Hero. And the kids, they took it out of English class, they got to do 15 minutes of Guitar Hero, and then they went into class, they spent less time on task, and they had better outcomes. And it's not surprising, right, because the brain was ready to learn.
Absolutely. And I do think that actually fits nicely into the idea of lifelong learning, really, because the idea of lifelong learning, right, is learning something that is actually going to transfer later into your life. So learning how to navigate the high stress time at lunch when everyone is yelling and screaming and maybe food is being thrown, and being able to navigate that in a way that you realize later on down the road, you know, I fit perfectly into this situation right now because I am able to handle a situation like that so much better. So that's actually a great, I mean, that's just a, you know, a great argument for lifelong learning, and what about lifelong learning is going to be so important to foster in K-12, teaching students that they're learning at lunchtime. Something is happening at lunchtime. So I think that that is actually a great thing to kind of segue into what lifelong learning is and what it really means for students. So I put this here just to talk about the, you know, if you tell a student, you know, they're going to be learning way past K-12, they might make this face. So we'll see. And so next, of course, is tech. So tech is not going anywhere, right? It's only going to be a bigger component of our everyday lives. What's going to be important is learning how to navigate that and use that to facilitate learning, to facilitate instruction. But of course, with everything else, tech has, you know, some of its difficulties. There's lots of variation in our ability to use tech. I am personally on the low end of the tech ability scale, but I've definitely known teachers, that one unicorn teacher who works down the hallway who knows every single piece of technology and is so good at using them, and then their door becomes like a revolving door, right? Because constantly everyone's like, I broke it, please help me fix it. So that happens a lot, so there's this big spectrum. Then there's also a lot of variation in the resources that schools have to use technology, to purchase technology. And then,
hold on, let's pause you for a second. So one of the things that I really want to point out with technology that we're talking a lot about in the government, because people get nervous. If you talk about national strategies, they think you're making decisions for teachers. And what we're really trying to do is set up a network so we make fewer decisions for teachers, so we empower teachers. And so technology in this case oftentimes is referring less to how do you teach something using technology, and refers more to how do you measure what someone learned in a personal experience or in an active experience so they get credit for it. I mean, my daughter is going around the country with me. She's learning something new every single day, right? As a 7-year-old, this kid can navigate Atlanta Airport quite well at this point, right?
Yeah.
And she knows how to go into museums of all different types, and she doesn't just get to watch on TV about the Museum of Natural History. We're going to be going there, both in DC and in New York City, right? So she's learning even though she's not in a classroom. How do we measure that? How do we give credit for that? And so those kids who are at home and build their own car, how do they get credit for that so that they're not having to go and take as many courses? Maybe they're saving money and not having student loans to be paying off, or maybe they're able to go straight into an apprenticeship job and have credit up the ladder. And so this technology piece in the government is really focused on giving credit, reducing standardized testing, and empowering teachers to have the time to do what they do best, not to be able to say we can replace teachers. Not true. Technology is not a teacher, it's a tool. And 2, not to give more burden or more policy to teachers. And I think that's where teachers are nervous when we get government folks working in it. But if you get government folks who know education, it's a very different combination than straight government folks who don't know education.
Exactly, and that actually segues nicely into our little issue with tech, which is just, it's important that we're not imagining tech as something that's a distract. Students often see tech as a distraction from learning, and then it's really important that we're considering tech as not a replacement for a teacher, but instead an opportunity to facilitate instruction. So the last thing we'll be talking about, of course, are some learner-centered strategies, which kind of tie all of these things in together, right? These learner-centered strategies are really going to help with this lifelong learning framework. And then what better way to use some learner-centered strategies than to incorporate some tech into doing those things. So like with everything else, it also has its challenge in being that as researchers, we know there's a lot of evidence for these learner-centered strategies, and yet with every single one of those, there's also an educational fad that follows, right? A fad that has no evidence, there's no proof that it is effective in the classroom, and it makes us, researchers and instructions make this face.
So can we give the big one for those online who are not educational researchers? The biggest fad that has been debunked is the idea of learning styles, that you learn better if you are a visual or a kinesthetic or an auditory learner. That's not true. It's more along the lines of that the content is better learned under one of these elements based on what it is that you're learning, but it is not centered on self. And we hear that so often. We also hear it in the military. Once people get a hold of it and it feels good and has a lot of what we call face validity,
yes,
we stick to it too hard.
Yes. And when you tell someone who believes so strongly in their learning style that we haven't found evidence for it, the sad faces are everywhere. So, but that is so true. So we have so many of these fads, and how do we, kind of diminish these fads and then amplify what's been proven to be effective by research? So there's a little introduction for maybe some of the challenges with these things, but now let's kind of talk about lots of the opportunities to engage in these things. So I'm gonna let you take away the beginning of lifelong learning, JJ.
Yeah, so when we switch from thinking about learning as something that is finite, that has an end point, and then you go do something with what you learn, when we change it to this concept of continuous learning, it means that, number one, you have to have a totally different mindset, right? So we can't just be focused on learning a thing, we actually have to be focused on learning process and learning motivation and learning that framework. The other thing that comes to mind is it changes the way we fund education, actually. So right now, we talk so much about K-12. We're starting to talk more about pre-K timeframe. We're starting to talk a lot about funding collegiate education, and now you're starting to hear more about the trades because they are so important. And it is not the case that we should have a one-size-fits-all solution. I like to say stop standardizing people and start optimizing what they're great at or what they enjoy doing. Because when we do that, we're a big enough nation that diversity actually shakes out really nicely. And so there are so many elements that really change in this. But to me, what happens in the classroom is that means I need to be looking at my students as whole people. Because if you're not going to be able to navigate the social elements or the emotional pieces of things, you're not going to continue to learn after school, after K-12. The other thing I need to be thinking about is how do I make sure you have the strategies to figure out what I call metacognitive strategies. We have to use that word because I just love it. I need t-shirts. What do I know? What don't I know? And where do I get what I need? Right? So that's going to instill that capability in someone so that when they're 40 years old and they have to learn a new career, they know the answers to those three questions. And then I would say the last one is really to help unleash the passion and excitement teachers have. I don't know a better way of saying it. It's just, I had the privilege and honor of talking to so many teachers when we were doing these studies. And they know what they're doing, and we need to trust that teachers can get out there and do this and impassion these students, but we have to get out of their way. And the way we rethink learning to be lifelong means if Johnny doesn't have it when he's 8 years old, it doesn't mean he's never going to have it. It means we can relax a little bit and trust that they're going to progress, right? Some people are going to get something at 22, others are going to get it at 30. And then, there's some people like my husband who at 40 are still learning Greek algebra. He likes to joke that he's this many, so I always say, okay, well, we're working on our 6-year-old skills. But it is true, right? All of us, and you all are nice and young, but I can tell you there's a number of us in our 40s who go, I'd like to go to college now. Now I'm ready, right? And so it changes our expectations and reduces that need to perform immediately. I think when you reduce that, you allow people to relax and enjoy learning, and I think you give teachers the keys, to the success space.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of benefits to it. It's just that it really changes perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what we kind of sum these two things up that JJ mentioned, I think they kind of sum up nicely into measurement and preparation. So measurement was that very first thing JJ mentioned, right? right now we look at learning as having this finite end. You know, typically it's your grade, right? You enter your class and you want to make this grade, you want to pass, so that way you can move on to the next grade. And then again, you're gonna make another grade so you can move on to the next grade and go on. And then you graduate from high school and maybe you'll go to college after that. Maybe you'll be like me and go to higher ed and be in school for 35 years. You never know. But there is a goal, and goodness gracious, I hope that I have a finite end. I'm certainly waiting for it. So, you know, you might be in school for a long time, but overall, the purpose is that you're looking at that finite end. You're looking at that end goal to then get a career and move on with your life. But the reality of that is that, like JJ mentioned in the beginning, then a career change comes. Then you need to go back to school. Then you need to learn a new skill. Lifelong learning is happening right now. It's happening all the time. But how can we develop a framework around it that's going to be more formalized, that's going to really teach students and prepare them for this kind of lifelong learning model? And the second piece of that is preparation. So how do we prepare them to be measured in a different way, right? That's pretty difficult. Students definitely expect to be measured in a very particular way, and they definitely do not like typically being measured in a different way. So how do we prepare them for this? And that really is the idea, you know, building that excitement, building that motivation for learning, and then also teaching them about how their skills that they learned at lunch is going to help them in the future. Teaching them skills that are going to be transferable for the future. Teaching them skills that will really benefit them for the future. So that way they can see what they are learning as something that's valuable to continue on and on.
Yeah, and I think to your measurement point, so one of the things we're talking a lot about in government is going to badging and competency. So think about the sash that you see on Boy Scouts, and they get their different badges for everything that they do. So, you know, maybe my daughter gets one for going to several museums and being able to talk about them. It's a totally different kind of measurement that has a whole lot less anxiety, and it's very credit-based. So in other words, we call it an asset model instead of a reference model. An asset means you look what you learned now, this is what you get to learn next, and this is what you get to learn next, and this is what you get to learn next, instead of look what you're missing. Look where you failed. Look where you have holes. See where the gaps are. Because when that translates to a classroom, what do I get? I get a teacher who has to have the meeting with the parent. Then I get an IEP, an individualized education plan. Then I have to start having special help. And now little Jane is having to come out of the classroom and is now missing time with friends and is now missing our social time and is now missing our other support time, right? And constantly that child's being told, you're not good enough and you're not making it and you're not moving as fast as everyone else. And every bit of psychology says this does not work. Mm-hmm. And you might say, and I know there's some pushback, well, you know what, sometimes we just have to tell kids this is the way it is and you need to buck up and you need to learn more. I come out of the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and if we're saying, no, we need to be supportive and we need to build people up so that they are ready for life, I think we're good. If the military says we can build you up instead of having to constantly tear you down, I don't think that argument holds very long, but I do know some people will try to play that card. But we've even found in the military, building on an asset is the way to do it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I think we were going to brainstorm together, but for the sake of time, we might just skip that and move on. But then afterwards, of course, we can hang out after and talk about everything too. So
we can geek out.
Yeah, we can geek out afterwards, 100%. So next, we will talk about technology, and I'll let JJ maybe kick it off.
Yeah, sure. So technology is both exciting and terrifying all at the same time. Things we are not going to get away from. Digitization is coming. And we have two choices. We can enter it safely and securely, or we can allow it to happen to us. And certainly, we have some not so close neighbors that are trying to hope, or are hoping that we will keep fighting with each other so that digitization just happens to us and we're not entirely prepared. But this enters the classroom in some very serious ways. One of them is that automation is going to come. And so we are going to have a lot of jobs that exist today that will not exist tomorrow. And no amount of forcing those jobs to stay is going to happen, because the reality is that companies are simply going to replace these positions with automated tasks. And you might think, oh, well, that's only going to be at a labor level. It's not. There will be engineer jobs and data analysis jobs and all kinds of educated positions that will also go away. So the question for teachers in the classroom is,
How do we make sure that kids are able to, number one, be prepared for jobs we don't even know are going to exist yet? And two, and this is the one that hits me near and dear as a psychologist, how do we make people resilient to the fact that they are always going to have to be thinking about what's next? It used to be the case that even though we knew the milkman was never going to exist forever, it probably was the case that that person got an entire career of being a milkman before they had to retire. That is not going to happen anymore. It's not going to be a full career lifetime time frame. So everybody's going to have to change. That constant change is actually really emotionally unsettling. And so people tend to want to, make things stick and stay because we want to stick with what we know. So I think we have a challenge for teachers in the classroom to actually teach the ability to handle the stress and chaos we know is coming. Mm-hmm. And that's where we spend more time talking about how this technology influences how we teach versus necessarily technology being something that has to always be in the classroom. Does that make sense? It's a little bit of a different perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that ties in nicely to just what I would like to talk about, because I think, as JJ said, technology feels very big, especially where we're going, and people, feel very emotional and concerned about automation and those types of things, and there's a lot of worry about where that's going to go. And as far as when I think about technology in the classroom and how we kind of settle that and kind of settle the worry and the fear, I think we can really just break it down into something really quite simple, and those are the access points for using technology, which is not really a surprise, but those are teachers and students, right? How are teachers and students going to use tech in the classroom? And there's something really important that underlies this, and that's that they're using evidence-based practices when using technology. So I think what's really, really important is this relationship is 100% possible. I know several people in this room who are constantly looking at the evidence-based practices for computer and game-based learning. They're out there and we know them. But it's very important that we're teaching students and teachers about them, that we're teaching students how to use this tech, how to become comfortable with this tech, how to letting them know that in no way in any world do we want to replace teachers with technology. Instead, technology should be used to facilitate instruction, should be used as a resource for learning, for students, for some self-driven strategies with students. That's really the goal here, and that's really what we need to do. So instead of thinking about this big picture of where's it going to go, what's it going to be, will there be robots rolling around everywhere, I think we can break it down, think about the basics, think about how teachers are using it, how students are using it, and making sure that evidence-based practices are lying as the foundation underneath all of those relationships.
Just for people online who are not familiar with the term evidence-based practices, what this means is that there is support in the research versus the fad that Shelbi was talking about earlier. And there are different ways that this is used. In the classroom, of course, we want all our teachers to be knowledgeable about these elements. When it comes to federal funding, there are now requirements through ESSA, which is an acronym, that we use evidence-based practices all the time for anything that gets federal dollars. This is a double-edged sword because on one hand, we, of course, theoretically, of course, we want you to be using those tactics and procedures that are shown in the research to be helpful. But on the other hand, it also sometimes forces teachers to be in a position of being a researcher. And that can be challenging with federal dollars, so we have to be careful. One of the things that I will add, though, is at the national level, there's a lot of talk about how we can help states and therefore trickle down to help teachers specifically in this area. And that is to say, there's a lot of research dollars that go to, say, one pocket in either a state or in a district. And it is the federal government's job to share that information, but we oftentimes don't do that. We end up keeping it local. So we want to have it local, and then we want to spend the energy also sharing it. We've got good news in Minnesota, we want good news in Florida too. Everybody should have the information. So that's one of the ways that we can facilitate instead of regulate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we will go ahead and move on to our last topic, which is learner-driven strategies. Here it goes. I'm gonna let JJ, if you want to take over.
Sure. So this gets into really
coming from the students. So most of the time we're trying to instruct teachers on how to be better teachers, but I think where we need to go, especially we talk about lifelong learning, is how do we teach students to be better students? How do we teach young people to be in control of and motivated by their own goals and interests? And so the learner-centered strategies look more from the student angle than from the teacher angle. And they tend to fall into things like I said, the metacognitive abilities, right? What do I know? What don't I know? Where do I get additional information that I need so I'm able to make a good decision? The other is going to be self-regulatory practices. How do I make sure those emotions are regulated properly in myself? And then also that I have the energy and motivation and the content knowledge to be able to go find what it is I need to learn and be able to interact with it well. And then the third one is going to be, how do I take what I learn in one setting and move it to the next setting? And then how do we make strategies to help you plan an entire multiple career lifetime, right? I mean, these are we haven't even gotten into, in fact, when we wrote this plan for the government, we only laid a light framework on that because it started to actually blow our minds. And we had a lot of really top people working on it, but when we got out of how do you learn this thing better to how do we create a lifelong learner, I'm in front of, yes, sorry, I'm starting to notice it. How do I get you to think across this large space? And how do I, as a teacher, instill those practices and capabilities in you? And that just gets very challenging. So at this point, I made the call, actually. I said, let's put a light framework, and then let's bring more people to the table to decide how we're going to do it, because I think there's a lot of research to be had here. It's going to fit in self-regulation, technology, and also what does the future look like?
Yeah.
All going to be brought together.
Yeah, I think that's my final ticking point here is just that how well all of this ties in together, right? It's starting from this life learning framework, looking at the learner as someone who is going to continue to develop and change and adapt throughout their life, and how do we foster that? And everything that we just talked about is the foundation at which supports those things. How do we get them to engage in these learner-driven strategies? How do we teach them to be a better self-regulated learner? How do we better help them to self-regulate their learning? And then how do we teach them things that are going to be transferable? I mean, and really that's where the value is. If we can teach a student something that is transferable and we can prove to them that this is transferable, and there are many cases this happens. I see a very funny meme on the internet all the time. I know I'm going to bring in memes now talking about evidence-based practices, but I'm going to bring it in because it's so great. But it's this meme, it says something, I'm really glad that I learned that pi equals 3.14, but I never learned how to balance my checkbook. True, right? Those are the types of things that, and that's just that's just the most basic thing that is going to be so important for learning. What more can we, just imagine what more we could expand on for these skills that are going to be transferable throughout the lifetime. And then tech is just at the center of that. Tech isn't going anywhere. It's going to stay with us. It's a great resource. It's a great way to engage in learner-driven strategies, to learn how to use these things, to use this to facilitate your own learning throughout your whole entire life. So all of this is going to be this very holistic process that really helps us to build a framework that's hopefully going to innovate education.
Yeah, so are we closing out?
Yeah.
I'll give some of my last points. Directly into the classroom, my thinking is, number one, we've got to empower teachers. So we've got to get policy to be enabling and not restrictive. And right now we're in a restrictive space. So just as I said, the measurement for students shouldn't be all about what are you missing. Well, the same is true for teachers. It needs to be less about what are you missing and more about how are you making success happen and how do we grow that. And it's actually really easy to do. We are capable of doing it. We just haven't had the right people in the government space to be able to do that. We often exclude teachers from the table. That also has to change. It was something that I was really particular about on the inside. We were able to get teachers in, but I will also throw some of this on teachers. We called a lot of more teachers than were involved, and many were not able to participate. So So come help. It's definitely my call to teachers, come help, come be involved. We need to do that. I would say the third thing is that we've got to deal with some of the tactical things for students. We talk about readiness in military, and that means you're ready to be engaged in whatever it is that they're asking you to do. The military looks at you as a whole person, as a whole family, so they make sure that your children and your spouse are taken care of as well, so that you are able to be ready for the work that you have. Well, it's the same thing for kids. If they don't have food or they don't have the means they need at home to be prepared and ready for school, readiness matters. And so that's where we need to have some federal dollars helping as well. Obviously, we need to help take care of the cost for teachers, but that is not a federal level. That's going to be at the state level, so we have to look at those. And then I would say the last one is really just planting the seeds of this new framework that is going to come. It's not going to come because it's a brand new idea. It's not going to come because someone wants to win an award. It's not going to come because we want to change things. It's going to evolve because the world has evolved, and it's a necessity. What people need to be able to do in the future is not the same as what they needed to do 60 years ago. But we haven't really edited education. We've just continued to regulate it further. So now we need to evolve education instead of regulate education. And those would be really my big points.
Yeah, I think that's everything that I want to say, except thank you very much.
Well, no, thank you. Thank you to everybody who stayed, and I know we were a little bit late today. Thank you to everyone online. We will be focusing specifically on education for the entire month of October. And so we will have a lot of these talks. Every day we'll be talking to new folks across the spectrum of education to talk about this ecosystem, how we want to help evolve, how we want to empower both teachers and students, and really look towards 21st century skills. So we hope you'll stick around and follow us as we build this out. Thank you so much.